Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet wrapped in a pandemic that's surging, sadly, here in the United States and a couple other places around the world, even as other countries have brought it under control, such that in New Zealand, you can go for a walk down a fairly crowded street and not be worrying about masks and the like. It means there's a lot of work to be done. It means there was a lot of failure through this past year, and on many fronts, signs of failure and erosion of some of the basic tools that have benefited society for generations. Scientific advice to underpin critical decisions in the face of uncertainty, a university system that is basically a part of our critical infrastructure to advance both understanding and the utility of knowledge in communities around the country. I've got some great guests today here on our Earth Institute Sustain What Friday session, where we kind of review the week. And here, of course, we're reviewing options for the new administration, Biden and Harris, as things move forward toward a new presidency. And for many, a sense of renewed opportunity to boost resilience and innovative capacity in a country sorely in need of that. I'm Andy Revkin at the Earth Institute, Columbia University. This is our initiative on communication and sustainability is designed to use conversation to drive us forward toward more resilient paths and solutions in a time of momentous change. One of the key factors or sort of sources I want to draw on today is a commentary that was in Nature this past week or so from Neal Lane and Roger Pilkey Jr., who are both, well, Neal is an eminent and experienced practitioner and scholar at that interface between scientific knowledge and the rest of us through the portal of the White House. He was the White House science advisor in, I think, the second Clinton administration, and at the National Science Foundation, director of that also in that period. Now at the Baker Institute at Rice University down in Texas with roots in Oklahoma, as I just found out. It's great to be with you, Neal.
Thank you.
And today also to begin the broadcast, we have also Romany Webb who's a senior scholar at the, a lawyer background at the Columbia University Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, a very busy place these days because it spent the last 4 years charting. They have a tracker for climate deregulation and another one for erosion of scientific integrity around the federal scientific landscape. Great to have you back on here, Romany.
Thank you for having me.
Naomi Oreskes was poised to join us, but has been dealing with a computer issue. And as cybersecurity is one of the problems we'll be touching on in the context of science advice and how the internet, which is also an incredibly important piece of infrastructure. I'm glad to see that Rod Schoonover is going to join us now. He was going to come in a little later, but great to have you here early. Here's Rod Schoonover, who was much time, more than a decade, in the national intelligence apparatus focused on climate change and pandemic risk, global health, and has been on this program many times since March. One of the first sessions we had featured Rod Schoonover. And Rod was famously or infamously chose to leave his position in the intelligence community when the Trump administration restricted his capacity to give the oral testimony part of a submission during a hearing on climate. If I have that right, Rod?
Written testimony.
Oh, it was the written testimony that they were excluding. So
I was permitted to speak for 5 minutes.
There you go. So it's great to have you all here. I thought we'd start with a look at Neal and Roger's commentary, which is really framed as Memo for President Biden, 5 Steps to Getting More from Science. As we said earlier, science is an abundant resource, but you have to be listening. There has to be trust, as Naomi would have indicated with her book, Why Trust Science? And a lot of that's sorely lacking in this country right now. And there's basic erosion of the capacity for science advice to get where it's needed. Let me just switch over here. I think I've got some of your key points here queued up. So Neal, what led you to write the piece? Obviously, there's there's an important moment here. But what pushed you and Roger to come together and pull this piece together, and then we could go through some of the points you made.
Well, Roger's really the lead author in this. I think he saw, he anticipated good timing with the election to say something for the two administration. It's very difficult to know what to say because the list of issues that relate to science and technology that are important and that Trump has stomped all over is extremely long. So trying to be selective, we sort of each pick out a niche and go forward with it. So this particular piece is focused on sound scientific advice to government and in the context of what's been done before to Trump, if you like, in a political way, the advisory committees and the use of science in general and regulation and in other policies, and then some in the Congress going along with that. So so I really have to credit Roger with giving me a buzz and saying, why don't we give this a shot? And we had our back and forth as we all do with the editors. And this is what came out. The fundamentals of what we wanted to say are still the same. So, and I don't know, Andy, if you're going to want to go through a few of those, but that's the context. We felt this might be a good focus. It wasn't something that had been sort of overdone yet in the media. Not a lot of attention given to having some specific recommendations. That's how we got started.
And let's talk about the OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is the first sort of bullet point you offered. I think hardly anyone in America knows who the current director of the OSTP is, the putative science advisor to the president. He's from Oklahoma, I believe.
Yeah, it's Kelvin Drogemeyer. Yeah, he's a weather modeler.
Right, and I've never seen such a duck and cover OSTP ever.
Yeah, well put. Yeah,
he had a lot to say about climate. He would have a lot to say about climate and extreme events. And
if you look at his controversial list of accomplishments, or I don't know, maybe it's a priorities memo, he does slip in the word climate one time in some of those. But if you're going to get anything done under those circumstances, you just kind of have to select how you go. And then Calvinism is a person of high integrity. And when you get to a hard line, you can't deal with anymore. Well, then you have to get out of the way. But I think Calvin has managed to dodge that. He's been criticized in the press for not getting a lot done, but given a good grade for trying some of those things. So yeah, he's the reason I know him is we're both Oklahoma alums, not in the same era, but I've worked with him when he was at Oklahoma.
And so having been in that position, how would you articulate the sort of what would need to be done to bring things? And I wouldn't say necessarily back to a position they were at, but like confronting the multiple risk landscape we face now. What would an ideal science advisory process for a president and an executive look like?
Yeah, I think not like the past. Is what I would say first. I don't think anybody can understand how the White House works unless you're inside. And even when I was at NSF, which wasn't very far away, these decisions would come down and I'd throw up my hands. Then when I got inside the White House, I understood how it worked. And I thought, oh my God, I mean, this is really how the White House works. So every White House is different. They kind of take their cues from the president, chief of staff, key aides. It's a team, but it's a team with a lot of competition in it, and so very much a personal environment. So a lot has to do with chemistry. But I would say the message Roger and I are trying to send is not business as usual. This office has the capability to do much more than it has done in the past. It's actually a federal agency. It has its own appropriation, and it was formed in 1976, if I got the dates right, by law, Ford administration. And it's ideally situated, in our view, to help with some of these issues that are larger than single agencies. For example, coordinating the response to COVID, which is what we're recommending. And then finally, more provocative yet probably, is the recommendation that this individual who heads this office, the director of the Office of Science Technology Policy, be appointed by President Biden to the cabinet, sitting at the table with the cabinet secretaries. That will send the signal that we aren't going to tackle pandemic or anything else, climate change, of course, being the biggest long-term threat, without elevating the profile and the responsibility and power authority of science and technology in the executive branch.
Yeah, that feels like such a no-brainer. And yet, is that something that can be then durably established, or that'll always be the whim of each of them?
Excuse me. No, that's easy. I mean, the statutory members of the cabinet are the 15 the secretaries of the executive departments, including the attorney general, and plus the vice president. But each president then appoints other members to the cabinet, and they sit at the table. They're real cabinet members. They're just not statutory, not required by law. So a president can just write an executive order and do it.
And although that, again, gets me back to this question with an issue like climate change, which has these multi-decadal realities in it. And we're going to talk about this with Romany in a minute, too, in the context of regulation versus legislation. It feels like if you're always going to have this kind of whiplash reality in the White House, that without a sense of enduring, bolting that seat down in a way, whether it won't be, as you said, it won't be one of the 15, but is there a way to kind of have that architecture be so politically normalized that it's an enduring thing?
Well, you could go rather like we said in our science integrity recommendation, without legislation. The way our government works, if you don't have legislation, you're going to be whipsawed. So you could, the president could go forward with the Congress to make the science advisor a statutory member of the cabinet. That would instill it in law. It would be required for future presidents, and it would happen. We did not recommend. That's a big step.
Yeah. And
we didn't address whether that should be the case. We left that unstated in our comments. But I would just say in general, if you want something to last beyond an administration, with all the risks of be careful what you ask for, legislation is the only mechanism we have. Romany knows about all that, so it gets put in law. It then gets translated into regulations and programs and all the good work that the government does.
Yeah. So Romany, I guess the same question applies. Of course, we're going to do a session a week from now on climate, energy options for Biden, digging a little deeper on that issue. But one thing that was pretty clear in all the work the Sabin Center did this past 4 years and plus is the executive orders of the previous administration. Executive structures are, as I've said online off and on, Obama did a lot of work across many agencies on climate. A lot of stuff happened, but to me, it felt like a very elaborate sandcastle built on a beach where, the tide is going to come in eventually. And a bully comes to the beach and knocks it down as you're getting to your bus and going back to your school. I know some of those realities are just going to be there. But when you look at both the regulatory realities and we'll get to the integrity issue too, what seems to be the opportunity right now, Romany?
Yeah, I think, your point, Andy, is absolutely right. But I think, President Obama did the best in the situation he was presented with. And I think, President-elect Biden is going to have to make similar compromises if the Senate goes the way that it looks like the Senate will go. But I do think, to come back to something you said at the outset, Andy, trust in science is really important here. I think over the last 3.5, 4 years, we've seen this real shift in the narrative around science. amongst Trump administration officials. Past administrations, we did see some anti-science actions, both by Democrats and by Republicans. But what's particularly notable about what we've seen over the last 4 years is this change in the way science is described. Past administrations pretty consistently, I think, at least publicly, upheld the value of science, whereas Trump administration officials have just sought to undermine it at every turn, suggesting that it's inherently unreliable or biased. As one Trump administration said, one of my favorite quotes, science is a Democrat thing. To the point that we have this kind of potentially, I think, large portion of the public who now really questions the value of science and it's really changed the way they perceive science and the role of science. So I think, to the extent we can't get a legislative solution, I think strengthening trust and belief in science, both amongst the general public and amongst lawmakers, will be really important to encouraging future presidents to, say, maintain a science person in the cabinet, things like that. So I think there's, a broader social piece to this that we should be bringing.
Here's a little coverage of that "science is a Democrat thing" meme. It's a shame. It's such a shame. And trust is a hard thing to recover. It takes time and it's so easy to erode, especially in our social media environment, where and the cultural cognition issues where your tribal affiliation in facing something like COVID-19 particularly tends to make you more of who you already were. So all you need to do if you're in the leadership role is sprinkle a little of doubt or disparagement, and boy, things can go sour in a hurry. And that gets to Rod's arena, and also we'll get back to the scientific integrity part. Rod, having experienced those pressures inside and looking ahead with that question as I framed it to Neal, build forward better as opposed to build back better. Would be my question to you. What would a scientific advisory process look like that could be more agile, more effective in looking at this landscape of very consequential but uncertain threats we face?
Right. It's a great question, and it's an important one. And, this is, mirroring my time in government, when I had one foot in the, science community and one foot in the national security community. I do worry about building back science incompletely to some degree. So, I worry somewhat about a lot of efforts that, I'll just talk to the national security part. If there's not greater attention paid to the scientific component of our defense and intelligence, and quite frankly, White House-based, interface between science and national security, I think we're going to lose considerable ground. Commentators often like to point out that the defense community is very facile in science, and that's true in some ways. But if you tried to find a climate scientist or an ecologist in the Pentagon, you would come up short. Just back to the article that Roger and Neal wrote, which I read it on the day it came out. I thought it was very powerful. I being in DC, I've heard whisperings of OSTP being elevated to a cabinet post. I'm largely agnostic, but on the other hand, I'm agnostic in some degree because I think that there's a real benefit in bolstering science throughout all of the agencies. But I think I've come to the conclusion that that's really not even sufficient. And I think I'm tending to be more supportive of it being elevated in the White House, in the cabinet, mostly because of all the other effects that, the other guests here know about, that, if OSTP were to be given a seat at the table, the White House has such an influence on domestic policy and foreign policy, security, and to have OSTP at the seat throughout the National Security Council processes. I worked in the State Department, where there are two cabinet members. The Secretary of State and the UN ambassador until recently. There's quite a downward effect in those agencies on how involved they are throughout the entire discussion. And so to have a scientist or someone from the science office represented in those processes is potentially very valuable, not just from a scientific standpoint, but also all the other policies and programs that the U.S. government considers. And just a second effect, it's one of the things that the United States has really fallen apart. And it's not the Trump administration, it's been decades now. And I think I've talked about it before on this program, Andy. But the real cratering of the ability to do long-term strategic planning. The U.S. government is almost entirely reactive. It's always about crisis management and going from one issue to another. And we really, really need to get on top of this. And if you look at long-term strategy, climate change and other ecological disruptive forces, and including pandemic preparedness, have to be a critical element of that kind of reformulation of grand strategy. And if you don't have the science agencies led by OSTP at the table, it's going to be the same kind of geopolitical mishmash that we've seen, in the past. I think the national security strategies of the past 6 administrations have been pretty lacking, in terms of a strategy. And so that is something that I hope can be folded into this.
Well, for Neal and for Romany, I'll remind them, or I'll illuminate them on something you said early that has stuck in my head, which is even with these strategies, even with the assessments, you have what I dubbed the page 21 effect, drawing on something you said about having written about the pandemic risk very clearly in the run-up to these recent years. But it always ends up on page 21. And it's like a checklist. We all know the things that are out there, asteroids, and that doesn't lead you to an actionable prioritization, an ability to deploy agencies in a coordinated way. The one thing I think that made sense to me about having an OSTP seat at the table with a president who, listens, is that, like with climate, I remember when I was a New York Times reporter, one year, I never got an answer to a very simple question. Where is there a list of who's doing what on climate across 13 agencies? And I don't think there's still an answer to that question. Like, what's the budget for climate science across all those arenas or, climate activities? And Neal, so I don't know if that feels familiar.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, Rod put it so well. The thing that surprised me from what Rod just said is I'm always talking, many of us always talking about the lack of the federal government's ability to plan. Science, technology, we've never had a plan. We have no plan now. Each president writes a paper. It lasts a little bit and it doesn't have continuity and so forth. This country does not plan. China plans. I mean, there are some other countries that have plans and they stick to them pretty well. And we do not. But what surprised me about Rod is I thought the one exception for the United States is national security. Defense really has a plan. I mean, they talk about strategy and they think long term. And to some extent, I think that's probably true relative to the larger situation I'm talking about. But it gives me a chance for an unsolicited ad. Norm Augustine and I are sort of walking the halls of Congress right now about a report that recently came out of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and Rice's Baker Institute. It's called Perils of Complacency, America at a Tipping Point in Science and Engineering. And it doesn't focus on a particular important area like climate change. The hook is really China. What it really says is that the report we wrote 5 or 6 years ago along the same lines is still pretty much valid, but what's happened since then is the accelerating almost rise of China as a major force in science, technology, innovation, and the markets. And they're beating us in many ways, and their curves are steep, and they're passing us in many ways. And we never compete on numbers, but now there's a quality competition we have to worry about. So we've used China as a hook, but as we were finishing the report, the pandemic hit. And boy, there's another example of not planning for the future. It should not have been a great surprise that we had a pandemic. It's just you don't know when it's coming. So back to Rod's point about the planning, we really need that, and it's only going to happen through some kind of legislation. The Congress is going to have to say, send us with every annual budget a rolling 5-year plan or whatever strategy we think might work well for science, technology, innovation. I mean, whatever the federal government wants to put together. And then finally, my comment on trying to find out who's funding what and who's doing what. You go to OMB and you say who's funding what and who's doing, and they say we're busy. Last thing we want to do is try to find out who's funding what, and of course they don't know until the very end when they add up all the numbers of thousands of budget lines, and then they can say, well, we're spending this on R&D, or we're spending this on nanotechnology, or whatever. So yeah, we need that. If we're going to have a plan, we also need to know what the numbers are and be able to tell the president. When I was in the White House, there was no way for President Clinton to know when he was making his budget decisions in December what the research budget, what the research funding profile was going to look like for the United States until I was able to walk in and say, Mr. President, this doesn't look really good. I mean, if you were to make these choices, your overall image on science would not be very good. If you make these choices, this will be one of the best science budgets that of a recent administration. There's no mechanism in the budget process for the president to answer such questions. So, yep, we need some attention.
Yeah, there seem to be two coordinating challenges. One is coordinating that inflow of insights, observations on a problem. I think you mentioned in one of your arguments for elevating OSTP was that they're a better arbiter of, CDC will always have an orientation toward a medical solution, but maybe not thinking about the social and economic context.
Sure.
So someone has to be looking at that, because remember, the flatten the curve thing was all about this balance between economic and medical realities. And someone has to be at those interfaces of these disciplines and these vantage points.
Well, and Rod made this point. One of your other comments, Rod, is the secretaries of these executive departments have lots of things to worry about. Those departments do far more than science. So often around the edges of the cabinet, I was never sitting at the cabinet table, but between at the break or before it started, a cabinet secretary would come up to me and say, we got this, Neal, we got this issue in science and technology or research or whatever it is. It could be very specific or somewhat more general. I wonder if you could, give some thought to that. And what they were really saying is, if you'll take that to the president, I'll be able to deal with all this other stuff. Well, that's just kind of crazy and ad hoc. And but it points to the fact that many of these agencies, NOAA, let's just pick one. NOAA is in a large department, and NOAA has no direct access to the president, to the White House even NASA, whole agency that's not under an executive department, really has no access, easy access to the president. So it's always through OSTP. Well, OSTP should sit at the table of the cabinet secretaries, and that way you get the president's attention and you're able to elevate the science technology issues on many of the minds of the people sitting around the cabinet. So I think elevate is a reasonable way to think about it.
The other, Rod, you can respond in a second, but I wanted to, so that I was talking about the inputs coming into that vetting process. And then there's the output to the agencies and consistency. One of the points you made in the Nature commentary, and that again, getting back to Romany's work, is on scientific integrity.
Yeah.
There's no standardization across the suite of agencies.
No, in Romany, every time I think about saying something should be legislated, I really do want to wait till tomorrow and rethink that, because you never know how it's going to go. But I really, Roger and I just felt on this issue, we've tried the other way, and it's not for lack of trying. Kelvin and the current administration and other science advisors, John Holdren certainly, it's just not high enough on the priorities of all the people who are already busy in all those federal agencies. And then there's always some pushback on one or another piece. So some standardization and some continuity is really what we're talking about. And the trust issue that Romany talked about, and that Naomi's book is about. If science fails on some of these big challenges, then we're going to have a huge trust problem. I mean, we are out there. There's no getting back on the pandemic, and I would say on climate change. Yeah. And if we get hit with a big cyber attack, science is going to be on people's minds, either positively or negatively. It's a big trust issue.
So, and Romany, it'd be great to hear from you a little bit on that. Given the limitations on what can go through Congress, even at the best of times, one thing I wonder sometimes is whether the external transparency imposing power that the trackers at the law school have been able to sort of consolidate has more value than we think. We're living in the world still has hidden corners and the like, but it's so much easier now for someone like Rod to make a point that something's being abused in an agency context, and to come forward and have that, change the landscape. It doesn't always work that way. This administration has been extraordinary. It's kind of like an extreme event in the climate system that we're experiencing. We've been experiencing extreme event in the socio-political system. But is there some power here we could amp up externally that might render some of these internal governmental solutions that seem so hard less relevant?
Yeah, I think, the publicization that we've seen over the last 4 years of these anti-science actions, the willingness of scientists and others who have been censored to speak up has been really powerful. And we have seen the Trump administration reverse course in some instances, with releasing reports that were previously withheld or things like that. It's definitely not enough, and it's a piecemeal approach that doesn't get to the heart of the issue. To get to the heart of the issue, as Neal says, we need legislation. There's a couple of scientific integrity bills floating around, some of them that have pretty good support, particularly in the House. It remains to be seen whether they have support in the Senate. But, I think we should also think more broadly about even if Congress can't pass legislation on these issues, what else they can do in this space. A lot of the committees have subpoena power. So can they subpoena withheld reports? Can they look more closely to the funding point that was raised before? Can they look more closely at how agencies are actually using or not using the appropriated funds for research? There's been reports recently that the Department of Energy is just sitting on all this money and not doling it out as they're meant to be to fund research. There's examples of agencies, the Department of Homeland Security, reallocating money away from research to some of their immigration work. And so closer scrutiny of those sorts of things by Congress, I think, could also be very powerful if we can't get that full legislative solution that seems so hard in the current incredibly polarized political environment.
And now I want to switch gears slightly and get to another point that was in the piece about academia as a sort of a critical infrastructure. That we don't think about it that way too often enough, perhaps. I'll show the bullet point here in a minute. But Rod, you've been in academia as well as in intelligence and other arenas. Romany, are you teaching right now, or are you?
No, I'm not teaching.
No, yeah, I'm not yet either. I'm doing a lot of workshops, and obviously, Neal, you've been for decades carving a great path in academia and in government. So, what maybe Neal, because it was in your piece with Roger, what strikes you as an opportunity there that can be an enduring shift for the better?
Well, I think what we directly addressed was just what lots of people have seen and are concerned about, namely the decline in funding of public universities, and we pointed to that because of our view that the public universities are part of the critical infrastructure, extremely important. They're in some cases the only place in a particular state or a community where free thinking is encouraged and where kids learn. And we know if they get their degrees, their salaries are better, and overall, they're somewhat more progressive in their views, and their lifestyles are happier, and so forth. So, because we believe in the value of higher education and the really seminal role of the public universities throughout all of this, all the Plain states and across the South. We're worried about the damage done to these institutions, both from cutting the funding and also just political attacks on them as liberal hotbeds of radical thinking or something like that. And then the attacks on Chinese students, students not just from China, but from other parts of the world, but mainly China, students these universities very much depend on in the research labs and in their own undergraduate population. So a lot of attacks on universities. And so it was our way of just emphasize we thought the importance of them were. It does, and Andy and I talked earlier, I do worry about how we reach the larger population geographically dispersed on these issues we're talking about. If it continues to be all about East Coast, West Coast, and Chicago, then we're not going to address some of these larger cultural issues, the trust with a capital T, across the political spectrum and across America. The public universities are a way to try to get that done. But if they're totally distracted by not having funds to just do their normal job and otherwise not encouraged to work together on behalf of the larger national needs, the larger public, we'll see how it'll happen. Kelvin Drogemeyer actually started an effort within the Plain states and southern states to bring together vice presidents for research to talk about the issues of their part of the country and try to identify and get some attention to the special needs of those public universities.
Well, that seems like such a lost opportunity, at least so far, that, and this is why I wish I'd tried to be in touch with Kelvin very early when he joined the administration, but they completely sealed him off from interviews. And I guess that gets to the reality that leadership matters, because the points he's made about that you're making right here are so important. And not just, when I was first reading your piece, I was thinking about critical infrastructure as a knowledge production, innovation driver, but the connectedness part, the trust part is a real deal thing. I just have to point back to a tweet the other day. I was at the University of Minnesota giving a talk a few years ago, and I met Mark Seeley, who's he's a agriculture meteorology outreach specialist there. He'd spent 40 years. He said he was just describing visiting every county in Minnesota to give climate and weather advice to farmers, literally thousands of people. And I think that gets at that end of the capacity that our university system has and can really be part of that. We were talking about climate services a few minutes ago, the capacity for everyone to understand that climate vulnerability is not a political issue. And there's things to do, whether it's better planting practices or soil erosion, all those things can be addressed in ways that could then also boost that basic understanding. Oh, this is what science can do for me. That feels like a really important opportunity. Let's put it that way.
Well, and we have a history, right? The land grant universities, the agriculture extension services. I mean, that was the beginning, pretty much the beginning of the government university partnership that was so effective in getting science out to the people. And then World War II came in, took advantage and expanded and amplified that partnership. And that partnership remains very important today, but it's under threat. So that's part of the arguments we're making, Norm Augustine and I are making with our other report.
Can you dive in a little bit on the refocused science funding? In other words, sort of what we fund?
Oh,
that'd be an
yeah. Well, that's a little provocative also, but I guess what we're saying is that the American people are depending on science to do something for them. The taxpayer money goes into funding research, and sure, we all understand that our discoveries in our laboratories, our curiosity-driven research, often lead to things that are important to people they want to buy or they need or that protect them from a national security point of view. But when you have something like the pandemic or climate change or cybersecurity, some of these huge existentially threatening issues, I guess you could say, science really has to come to the fore. I mean, there's an editorial in the current Science magazine. Actually, the last line of that editorial says, I don't know, something like, when the people need science, science needs to respond. That's right. The issue. That's all Roger and I are saying. And then we have that sentence that I know it'll kind of considered a throwaway about, don't take this out of basic research, but we're serious about it because you really, in the end, don't know where some of these major discoveries are going to come from. So this is not an idea, let's just reorganize the federal budget to take the money away from basic research and give it to more use-inspired basic or applied research. That's not what we're arguing, but we are saying, look, there are some of these huge existential threats, and they have to do with science, and science has to respond. It's our responsibility to do that.
So that gets to Rod's points, I think, a little bit too, in terms of how national security advice is shaped and how we do or don't respond. I remember several years ago, I saw some really good arguments for just a really big boost in the flu virus research, so that we have a standing capacity to generate a new vaccine,
right?
Or to have a general vaccine, so it's not, you don't have to have a new one every season. And that was before the pandemic hit. So I'm thinking that prior to some way to sort of stimulate or incentivize that, there's so many issues that arose around the warp speed vaccine approach. And so what's the, and I remember on this, the Council on Foreign Relations back in March had a really good panel on the virus and what we knew we didn't know. And there's a woman, O'Toole, maybe Tara O'Toole, who was talking about CRISPR, the role of CRISPR and, the genetic manipulation method and really changing both viral vaccine development and just mass production and all that kind of stuff. So that feels like an arena where so much more can be done.
Absolutely.
But it's not like it's not responding to the moment. It's general capacity.
Well, I mean, science isn't an actor, right? Science in and of itself cannot do these kinds of things. It's human beings who have to, be the spearhead here. And but there are so many threads that I want to pick on. But I'll just jump on this last part. That the security landscape that the United States and the rest of the world is heading into is probably pretty different than what we've seen in the past. And it looks to be, a period of disruption and shocks that probably require us to rethink what our national security posture really is. During the 20th century, it was pretty easy to figure out who the adversaries were and, malign actors, even into the later 20th century. But as the 21st century develops, we're confronted with a number of actorless, non-military national security threats. And our best tool in confronting those is not geopolitics or international relations, it's science. And really trying to figure out the best way to weather these challenges and ensure the security of the nation. And I don't think I think you might have to go back to the nuclear crises of the mid 20th century to really look at when science has been more critical, in terms of pandemic risk, which is, it's hard to say this, after all the fatigue and damage that COVID-19 has inflicted on the world, but this is just one in a series of.
Ooh, Raj has frozen here. Let's see if he unfreezes in a second. That point, I just did on Wednesday a session with the membership of the Society for Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty. Oh, yeah, Rod, you froze there for.
Yeah, I know. So
I was just saying while you were frozen that I just yesterday and the day before did 2 webcasts with people from the Society for Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty.
right.
And their whole approach is robust decision making in the face of known uncertainty and that you can't clarify, like climate change. We know pretty powerfully that we're not going to know how high sea levels will be in 2100. That's a known. That's a slow-moving target. And yet, airports and coastlines and everybody has to figure out how to invest for a future with that level of known unknown. And then, of course, with viral emergent risk and the way the internet works and doesn't work, I think those are beyond even Facebook's understanding. So that feels like developing a capacity to have that approach normalized seems very important as well in shaping a new science advice ecosystem. Neal, is that part of what you're thinking when you talk about it? Not just going back to pre-Trump like PT norms.
Yeah, and yes, indeed, and of course I've thought about it. I don't have the experience at all in national security domain or in law either. I think of it in terms of just the jobs I've been involved with, and so in OSTP, I view there are 2 jobs there for the science advisor. There are a lot of sort of routine things that need to be done that are more incremental and that address being sure that the agencies are able to do what they're supposed to do in research and development and other applications of science. And then there's the being alert and ahead of the game, if you can be, in crisis. Because when a crisis comes, the one we all think about as science advisors is the asteroid is coming. Okay, right. So suddenly it's a movie almost. So the asteroid is coming, and now the science advisor brought right into the Oval Office with a minute's notice and says, "What do we do about this?" So, but you can't just ad hoc those kinds of things. So your conversation with Rod about anticipation is really important, and that's part of the planning. And right, it's planning beyond science and technology, but in all of these potential crises that will come again and again and again, more pandemics, cyber attacks, maybe the asteroid, they all have strong scientific components. And you can't anticipate them in detail. You don't know the timing. So the error bars are large, and that's just management. So you got to figure out how to set your priorities and manage so that you are in the best position to deal with these crises when they come. And the agencies, of course, even more so, because that's where the real expertise is. But OSTP is the place that has to sort of keep it together and make sure that attention is being given in the appropriate agencies to these potential crises.
And
Yeah,
Romany.
I just wanted to jump in and say, I think when we're thinking about sort of this on a broader scale and tying it back to the trust issue, more effectively communicating what science can and can't do, and the inevitable uncertainty in a lot of these scientific fields, and the inevitable evolution of sort of scientific fact, if you like, in some of these fields. I think we saw that in the COVID crisis, where the fact that initially people like Fauci were not recommending mask use has really been sort of jumped upon by people who have a some other reason for not wanting to wear a mask, and they can point to that as, well, the science doesn't know, so why should I wear a mask? And I think more effectively educating people, particularly lawmakers, but not just lawmakers, about what science can and can't tell us, and where there are gaps and uncertainties will be really important going forward when we're dealing with these sort of bigger existential issues.
Well, that I totally agree with that, but it does always remind me of a question that I don't really know the answer to. Science is about openness and freely exchange of ideas, and so when we do that in the public, it often just looks like a mess. So we kind of engender trust in a way by being open and transparent, and then we undermine it by he says, she says, he says. I don't know how we deal with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like walking a tightrope, right? It's really tough, I think, to for the layperson to sort of understand that back and forth. And in the legal field, a lot of those back and forth discussions don't get discussed for precisely that reason, because you don't want to sort of undermine trust or confidence in the end result. But in the scientific field, it is important that people understand sort of the broader process. So, I think you're right that it's a really difficult balance to strike.
The only thing I can think to do is just to try to maybe for the scientific societies and working with their members to encourage scientists to be mindful of how their comments and their views are interpreted by the larger public. Most of us as scientists don't have much experience with that. We don't understand the public very well. We talk a lot about, gee, if the public would just understand us, but really the issue is the other way. So that then when we are out there talking or debating, even in the public, that we do it mindful of the signals that we're sending.
Well, I think you're both getting at a point that I've just the other day on the session on deep uncertainty showed this slide from back in 2010. I wrote a story for the Times when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had hired a consultancy, and like a PR agency, to figure out how to communicate the report that was coming at that time. And the advice they got was, well, journalists and the public don't think of words the same way you do as scientists. So they were saying avoid saying the word uncertainty and risk. Those uncertainty and risk were words that the scientists were encouraged not to articulate. After I wrote about it, Pachori and others were saying, no, we're smarter than that. But I think this idea, and this is why the invisibility of the science advisor the past 4 years and the possible elevated role, as was the case for Holdren under Obama, really plays a pivotal role. And also along with the universities, just as Neal was saying, that university network is a conduit for trust that to the wider public, if you're involved with the public in ways that are engaging on the problems they face in day-to-day lives. So the last thing we need, to my mind, is scientists dancing around words like uncertainty and saying, in science, uncertainty is a form of knowledge. Plus or minus X leaves you a space in which to make a decision. And it's not ignorance. And that feels like but that only comes through sustained engagement. That's part of why I'm building this initiative at Columbia, is to have a higher comfort level for science public discourse. So we'll see how that works out. And I'm glad to see Rod is back too, because these points are very important in the terms of how we talk about risk at the levels that you think of it on too. And actually, Rod, who are you? So now you're sort of an independent consultant now, and the like.
Right.
How does that work? Who's listening?
Still parts of the government. I still engage with the defense community and the intelligence communities and different science organizations. And, there's quite a bit of interest in people who can articulate some of the security dimensions of, what I had been talking about earlier, the non-military national security threats. And, there's a growing number of us. I think their perspective, especially those who can really well articulate the scientific dimensions in a straightforward way. I I think there's a quite a benefit to the, at least the discourse in government, but beyond that as well. I froze because I'm still in the mountains of North Carolina, where anyway.
Although I'll tell you,
one of the things,
sorry, yeah.
one of the things I really wanted to pick up on, from about 15 minutes ago, was our university system. Being inside of the government for so long, and at the State Department, where there's so much interaction with foreign governments, you really learn the depth of what a national asset our university system is. And I was a professor in California when it was going through a really tumultuous budget period, where I can't really describe fully the adverse impacts on students and faculty, from a financial labor perspective. For example, we had situations where junior faculty were coming in at higher salaries than people who had been there for 25 years, because that is how the business had to operate to compete. But just the disruption that would cause inside of these organizations was tremendous. And then, watching student debt just balloon. These are things that should never have been allowed to really continue on the trajectory that they did. And the alternative financing model that was developed decades ago didn't pan out. And a reinjection of funding resources into the university system, because it's a national asset, is desperately needed. And they steer towards the universities on just, again, a narrow focus. They would come to us in the security community and ask, what kinds of research would best affect your mission? I'm not sure we could have said that from a government-wide perspective. I could just lend my own perspective, but that's insufficient. So this is not what you see in other countries that we're trying to compete with. It's not just China. It's South Korea, to a lesser degree India. So it's the idea of strategic planning for our own scientific assets, in addition to our national security assets. There are other countries that do this well, and we should reboot this process in the United States.
So we're close to the end here, and I really like some of the points that have been made. We could summarize a few of them. One is somehow building a longitudinal, longer-term assessment process and planning process in a country that's very fragmented and variable and focused on the moment, with the internet and the internet news making us even more focused on, like, not just the day or the week, but the hour. So we have this ADHD problem.
And a fragmented internet.
Yeah, no, I know. We're all completely and hacked and designed to distract us and designed to divide us. And that we can have I've had several discussions here and more to come on that point. But maybe I just have each of you just summarize a key thought about the opportunity to start in a different path here. Neal, we started with your commentary and with Roger Pielke Jr. And
well, many of us often get asked, is this a Sputnik moment or the Apollo moment or whatever? Well, it's a pandemic moment or a COVID moment. I think it does stand out in history not as the unique, it's unique in many ways, but a wake-up call. And I think we should take advantage of the fact that, that this horrible virus that has damaged so many people, their families, and the economy exists. We should not miss the opportunity to point out how we're only going to deal with things like this by advancing science, engineering, and technology, and that has all the ramifications in the issues we're talking about from the policy side, funding, integrity, law, regulation, all the rest of it.
And Romany, you know, if Kamala Harris was sitting here right now, I don't think we could hope to have Biden here, but what's your 30-second thinking based on what we've been talking about? Like, what would be the thing you crave most in looking at the landscape you deal with every day on climate science, integrity, and law?
Well, I want to make 2 points, I think. One is sort of outside my day-to-day job, but just to pick up on Neal's point, I very much agree that we should be taking this opportunity and moving forward and recognizing the value of science and the need for science and technology and research in this field. I think as we're doing that, we, of course, need to be bringing everybody along with us. So thinking through those sort of science communication issues that we talked about today, that we talked about, Andy, last time I was here, is hugely important. I think in terms of sort of the regulatory piece of this, some of those issues that we discussed around better coordination between not just sort of across federal agencies, but also between divisions within federal agencies, combining the science and the policy to produce a scientifically rigorous, but also sort of economically valid, socially acceptable solution is how we're going to address these really important existential threats like climate change and other things.
That's great. This has been a really wonderful session. Hopeful and still unnerving at the same time, which seems like every day these days, especially with the pandemic still unfolding. I want to just acknowledge the struggles of the healthcare community and places where the surge is greatest right now. And hope you all stay safe and sane through these weeks and months to come. This is a long journey through a new century that's full of surprises, that's for sure. So I'm glad everyone here is deeply dug in still and always on the work you do. And a shout out to Roger Pelkey Jr., who couldn't be with us today. Illness in his family. And I want to point to what we're going to do on Monday. Sunday is another one of my music sessions, which will be great fun. But on Monday, this is another critical component of our knowledge infrastructure is Wikipedia. And it's a magical thing amid all the storms and just information storms and infodemics and fake news. Wikipedia still works. It's still working, but it doesn't do it by itself. It's a huge community. And I'm going to have live on here some of the people working on the climate chapters of Wikipedia. And there's an edit-a-thon coming up late in the month that you can learn about. And everyone with knowledge and time, which is a scarce resource, can be part of that as well. So thanks again to Neal, to Rod, to Romany, and Naomi Oreskes, who I'm sure will be on another week. Sustain What is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration. That's the Zoom we've been on the last 60 years or so. And the great pause that this pandemic has forced upon us through our own failings. A prime focus of what I do is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's an amazing thing. It's the way we're able to connect today. It's also a very distressing and fractured and distorted and hacked system for the moment. It's a brand new part of the earth, and we don't know how to use it yet effectively. We're trying. As soon as we're done, share the link you're watching on with friends and neighbors and whoever else you think might benefit from this discussion, and get in touch with me via the contact info in the little scrolling bar at the bottom if you have ideas or feedback on how to make the show better. And again, be well, stay safe, and onward we go. Take care, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.